Hey Seth, you're a really interesting person. You've done plenty in your life. We're definitely excited that you chose to share some space with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Pleasure is all of ours. And I would say that, anyone can go online right now and Google your name, and they're going to find that you're heavily involved in the arts, in design, in public engagement. You've been doing it for a number of years. They'll also find that you have a bookstore that acts like a wine bar. But for starters, Jay and I, we were really curious about what your life has been like, because just in the past week or so, you officially went out with your first book called Radical Curiosity. So congratulations, it is out in the
Thank
world,
you.
right? And so that clock on the ripple effect of this thing has started. And so I'd just be curious, like from a human level, how does that make you feel, even though you've been so accomplished in your life, knowing that you have a book out now?
Well, I love this as a place to begin, and thanks for the warm welcome. I like with the beginning of a more human question, as you say. It's interesting that you mentioned the bookstore, right? I like you describing it as a bookstore acting as a wine bar. We think of it as a kind of community center, and it's really a passionate project of my wife and I. We co-founded it together, and I think actually that's been one of the most remarkable parts of launching a book. That we opened the bookstore 8 months ago, and we are featuring the book at our bookstore. And it has a little art gallery at the bookstore where we've designed an installation to visualize some of the research and the thinking behind the book as
Nice.
a set of experiments to engage our guests at this curiosity store in new ways. So it's fun to kind of walk into a three-dimensional experience of the book and to have conversations like these with folks that maybe I would not have crossed paths with and talk about really big ideas. So
Yeah.
it's been a lot of fun. It's been 1 week. You're on the 1 week anniversary.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. And that sounds like a much more immersive experience. So that's really interesting to want to check out, because there were some really interesting stats and, imagery from your book that, we can talk about. And obviously this entrepreneurial journey with your wife must be something that's exciting. You mentioned that, but talk a little bit about that, because you've done a lot of entrepreneurial things in your past. And so I'd be curious how this one stacks relative to that. And I really want to understand, like, more about you. What was life like for you growing up? What were some of the key pit stops in your life? And walk us through that entrepreneurial journey and your experience a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. I had a fairly unique upbringing. I was raised in the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York in a very rural environment. And so nature was kind of my cathedral, if you will.
Mm.
The kind of slow pace of life was the sensibility that brought me into the world. And I was originally an artist, an oil painter, actually. I was exhibiting professionally by the age of 11 in art galleries. And I went to art school, and I felt that the kind of modern model of a creativity education was actually quite isolating, right? I went to RISD, the kind of Harvard of art schools, but you kind of go into your small studio. Jackson Pollock speaks from you, from your soul. You make beautiful things. You show them to a professor every week, and then you just do it again. And I loved being at RISD. RISD really helped make me who I am, but I knew I didn't want to have an isolated life. I was much more social and kind of public and political. I've had a kind of activist spirit. And so my life, I love the theme of entrepreneurship that you all talk about. I came to entrepreneurship as a way to invent worlds, right? So whether
Mm.
I was an artist, a designer, a business builder, an event builder, I'm a kind of serial entrepreneur, but I think of businesses as projects, capital P projects that are not, a day or a week, but they might be a decade. They might be a century scale. And I think I've organized my life as a kind of thread of projects that are connected by asking really rambunctious questions.
And I love that. Actually, on that, have you always questioned things? Because again, you just said you use entrepreneurship as a way to invent worlds, which to me, reading between the lines, requires that type of radical curiosity, to steal your title. Mm-hmm. Have you always questioned things? And I'd be curious if there's been times in your life when questioning got you in trouble.
Yeah, well, I think I have, right? I think there's a particular sensibility that artists and designers and entrepreneurs, I think there's a kind of maker, builder, questioner mindset. There's a lot of characteristics that are this common, like a lake of fluid, kind of raw material in the way that our heads are designed, right? That there's a particular field, I think, binds us no matter what the form is, right? And I think one of the things that binds that ecology of people together is questioning and curiosity, right? An engineer asks questions, an inventor asks questions. I mean, we're so used to professions being our identities. I think partly I wrote the book because I think that questions can be implanted signatures of our identities, like a DNA or a kind of like a fingerprint that we know ourselves as the questions we ask. And I've been kind of quite concerned, depending on how far you've made in the book so far. The first really micro chapter opens with a hypothesis that curiosity is an endangered species. Right. So there's a bit of a kind of rallying cry, a kind of case for why are we seeing less questioning, and a kind of case for the value and the importance of that as part of the human experience. And then the rest of the book really shares 7 narratives where I believe questioning is either already or needs to more exponentially unfold, like a kind of a tsunami wave, if you will.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I was thinking about too when I was moving through your book was this question of perhaps we're not curious enough about like high quality issues. I think there is sort of this like impulsive curiosity that we all have to find out what happens in the season finale of, our favorite show, or figure out what the outcome of this celebrity trial will be, or, checking our phones to see if our stock portfolio is up or down from where it was a couple hours ago. But it seems like there's a sort of connection between being curious about high quality issues and taking the long-term view that you have with your business. Like, to be curious about high quality issues is sort of inextricably linked from thinking about the long term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like how you're calling it the high quality. I mean, that's an interesting way to describe it. That's why I distinguish that it's not a kind of passive curiosity, which is I think what you're getting at, right?
Right.
It's a kind of intentional, essential questioning. So essential questioning, or the term radical curiosity, radical comes from the Latin term radicalis, which really means the roots of things, right? So I think what you're also implying, I think we kind of scurry on the surface. We're curious in a kind of passive sense about information and the update, right? We kind of stay on the surface crust of the earth, if you will. But we rarely have, to use your term, businesses or inquiries that really peel back the layers of the onion, ask about the human condition. And I think that's really what I'm advocating for. Like, we need to kind of revisit some of the most essential Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of questions. What do we really mean by health? What do we mean by learning? We just kind of passively use these terms and accept them as assumptive. But actually, we need to really kind of go further back upstream and ask the underpinning questions of, what do these models even mean? Where do they come from? And maybe it's time to upend them. And if we're going to upend them, we sure as hell better ask really deep questions.
Right.
Yeah. So actually on that, how would you say in your work with leaders and in your work, with the research putting this book together, how would you say we could get better at improving the effectiveness of our questions?
Hmm. Mhm. Well, mostly you should join this podcast show, right? I mean, isn't that what we're all
A good
right?
start.
Good start. Yeah. Well, no, I do think, I mean, I'm half joking, but what we're doing right now, right? We are experiencing an unscripted dialogue. And in order to have a true, honest, and integrity driven exchange, I mean, we're having a kind of baton pass of ideas in which this is an unscripted, uncertain discovery. We don't really know what's going to happen next. So part of what we need to do is put ourselves in conditions that are less structured, that are less scripted, that are less predetermined. And we need to make ourselves a little bit more uncomfortable, right? It's a little quiet out there. We got really big, complex challenges facing us over this next century. Feels like it's a little bit on autopilot. So it might be helpful as a place to begin to just enable ourselves to not know, to be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? And there's a lot of ways tactically and in practice to kind of do that. There's some building blocks we propose. My studio and I have developed a practice that we articulate in the book. We could talk about that a little bit. But I think even just kind of deciding, like to arrive to a day, deciding I am not just going to passively move through as though everything is locked and predetermined and I'm just a vessel moving through someone else's plan. Let's just begin with shaking things up a little bit, right?
It's so funny you say that because as I was, digesting your material and doing research, I couldn't ignore the juxtaposition of what you're putting on the table versus what we're seeing in society with this whole like quiet quitting movement and how people are basically coasting. And I was just like, oh, I wonder if Seth really thinks people want to put effort into thinking when they're trying to figure out ways to just do the bare minimum.
Well, I love that you brought that up because I think it's interesting to consider, like, let's use radical curiosity as a mindset to even interrogate what quiet quitting is.
People coasting, isn't it just coasting?
Well, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
What do we think quiet quitting really is? There's so much lingo and so much kind of buzz terminology, right? The great resignation, quiet quitting, all these kind of new terms. But I mean, I'm interested in all the 360-degree multi-stakeholder views on this. I've actually enjoyed some of the op-eds say, it's not quiet quitting. I'm just not willing to work overtime for free.
Right,
Or,
exactly.
it's not quiet quitting. I'm just going to preserve my mental health, right? So I think there's some, kind of shades of gray here. I do think that the workplace, the social contract, and the actual value exchange contract of the workplace is one of those beautiful operating system reboots that we're seeing. And I think all of the traditions that were normative, both pre and post pandemic, deserve some real essential questioning. I would be cautious not to just think that quiet quitting is a singular narrative, right?
For sure. Yeah, I think when I think of quiet quitting, I think of people that maybe tried to create a different environment for themselves at work, tried to improve their communication with their peers or their managers, or tried to improve certain processes that were central to their work, and they weren't able to make progress in that regard. And instead of investing more of their energy and time into their current workplace, I think a lot of people that are quiet quitting are probably also looking for work elsewhere. So it's sort of saying like, I'm going to cease to invest more than I have to where I currently am and look somewhere else where I feel where that investment will, investment of time and energy will more adequately reward me in the long run.
Yeah, I think all those reads are absolutely a part of it. I think this is one where there's probably not one read, right? There's probably like a multi-fractal kind of, refracting diamond of the many colors and interpretations of what's going on. I mean, I've been fascinated. I don't know if you all have heard one of the terms that has been a kind of translation term of the Great Resignation that I've been interested in is the Great Simplification.
I haven't heard that yet.
Yeah, I've been a big fan of that terminology. I identify with that. I mean, I think, look, I've said a few times on some of the conversations I've been having, so apologies if there's a minor repeat, but it's just a really passionate issue for me. Look, the pandemic had its toll in people's health and wallets and justice around this country and others for several years. Some of my own family was affected by it. But I think one of the legacy gifts of the pandemic is that when we face an existential crisis, right? When we can't work, it's only natural to question, what is work? When we can't go to school, we have to ask, what is learning, right? So when business as usual goes on a suspended leave, we question all these basic essential things. And I bring this up because I think some of what I see happening is we are still healing at a society level, right? And it's going to take some time. But I also think the operating system of a nation or a kind of global society is getting rebooted. We are literally writing the code once again on the operating system of what we want to happen next. And I do think I identify with, can it just become a little more simple? Things have gotten so complex, all these social systems, it's like we've designed them in such a complex way in this patchwork quilt over the years. We don't even know how they work. I don't even know how to navigate the healthcare system. I don't know why my kids go to school. They're thrown into jail if they don't go. It's like a law. It's weird.
Yeah.
We live in a strange time, but I love this story of maybe some of us would like an era of simplification. The great simplification seems really appealing. I know, I might be interpreting it in new subjective ways. I'm bringing my own baggage to it, but things don't have to be this complicated. Maybe that's part of the essentializing of the questions I'm after,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Arjun. Oh, I was just going to say,
sure.
I think that ties into that idea of first principles pretty neatly that you brought up in the book. It's one of those things where I know what it is, but I won't do a great job articulating it. So maybe for any listeners out there that have not yet encountered this mental model, you could share what first principles thinking is.
Yeah, absolutely. I felt like when I was writing the book, I mean, part of the objective of writing the book was to codify a practice that we and my team and I do in the studio every day. But it was a kind of research project to articulate it with greater clarity. And we have been asking questions for decades. It's very design thinking practice for all the buzzwording, what design thinking is. But it's interesting. First principles is a kind of Aristotle historic philosophical idea, right? And people today, business leaders like Elon Musk is a big advocate for first principle thinking. Essentially what first principle is in any problem solving process or even just thought and strategy, right? One of the things that first principles proposes is how do we reduce all the variables into its most essential form? I think of it almost like the periodic table, right? In science, like all the complexity of science, we reduce all the elements. We go, there are things smaller than just hydrogen, right? Like it's like the most basic building blocks of life. But often when we are given a problem by our supervisor, our manager, our friends, communities, work we do, right? We go right into the problem solution and we don't distill down what is even the problem, or as I like to say, what is even the question propelling the problem, right? We don't necessarily kind of, it's almost like boiling the ocean to get to the many pieces that are the most essential. And that's really what radical curiosity is all about. Like one of the more joyful ways I see this, right, is molecular gastronomy cooking, right? You know, Chef Jose Andres and these guys that, and incredible chefs, this genre where they take like something like mayonnaise or something that, you know, is very ordinary, but if they use a kind of science to bring it down to its building blocks and then reassemble it, so you have the same taste, but the texture, or it's in air, or it's flying, and they change the properties to make it something new. It's like jazz or improv, but for the kitchen. And I think those practices could be really, really valuable to revisit or re-enter anew some of these old wicked problems that we still haven't gotten great solutions for, right?
Yeah,
Is that useful, helpful?
Absolutely, yeah.
It takes it down to some of the bare basic elements and fundamentals, and then from there you can basically remix those ideas and try to come up with your new original thinking for the new problem that's facing you. Because you know, oftentimes we just try to think about the solution that worked in the past for another scenario that was very similar but wasn't quite exactly the same. And so it's one way of just being like, I'm going to look at each situation and challenge and problem as its own, and then from there break it down, and then from there try to see if I can remix a creative solution. And it's really interesting that you talked about how we jump to solutions, and where a lot of us are solution providers and a lot of us have a consultant title, blah, blah, blah. And I think that's really interesting because, you know, it's like you allude to it in your writing that it's actually made us think way too swiftly, which is the opposite of what is required if you're really trying to be radically curious, which takes time. So it's interesting that, broadly speaking, because of the fact that we might have to hit a quota, you know, we rush to a solution, and we're training ourselves as a society to act curious instead of actually being curious.
I like that. I love that you're bringing us there. I mean, I'm just checking on. I love this quote. I want to share with you from one of the chapters. I call it "Befriending the Sounds of Slow Time." Right. And, you know, I think we have this saying in our studio. We say, slow down in order to speed up. And I found this gorgeous quote from Georgia O'Keeffe, the beautiful oil painter, right? And she says, everyone has many associations with a flower, the idea of flowers. Still, in a way, nobody sees a flower, really. It is so small. We haven't time. And to see takes time, like to have a friend takes time. Right? I love that idea that seeing takes time, like to caretake a friendship, right? How beautiful is that? I mean, I think if we really want to solve these things, you know, it's just like, do we want people to be healthy? Because I don't know, it doesn't seem to be working. Do we want to feed the entire planet? I don't think we're there. We might need really, no pun intended, or lots of pun intended, like radically new ways to enter these questions. What is food? What do we really mean by health? We have to ask these questions because I think we're so quick. You said it so well, that we're so obsessed with production, and we hold the action-oriented leader like a badge of pride. But speed and moving into the transaction doesn't seem to be actually producing the outcome we're looking for, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it definitely takes a lot of courage to be curious. I think with whatever kind of institution you're navigating, whether it's your workplace or government or society writ large, like there are incentives in place for certain people to keep things the way they are. So to be radically curious is to ask questions almost inevitably that certain people don't want asked. So I think like to be that person, the man or woman in the arena asking these questions does take a bit of courage even to put yourself in that position.
Yeah, I love that you share that. I think it does. I think especially now. But my concern is, I would just say to your listeners and to anyone that is drumming up that courage, the cost of not is greater, right?
Yeah.
The risk of not stepping forward into the courageous Rome gladiator, kind of Colosseum, with the imagery you evoked in my mind with your question. I mean, what's worse? I mean, has anybody go through that pandemic? Like, were you there? Like, we kind of bottomed out for a minute there. Right?
Yeah, that's for sure.
Like,
for sure.
It's if we don't need more evidence, we don't need more evidence. Not no if. Let me drop the if. We don't need more evidence that it's time to drum up some courage and ask some questions, right? The models that we live by are not working, and they're not working for all of us. But guess what? The other side of the courage is like, once you pass through that threshold, God, it's so freeing and it's so exciting. There's so much joy in reclaiming the power to co-author what do we want the world to look like, right? Like, it's an extraordinary time to be alive. Everything is getting redesigned. We should probably lend our voice to it. All of us are customers of the future. Right? We have a stake in what happens next. And anything that is a message or a policy that does not embody that should probably be questioned at the least and dismantled in inning 2.
Right. Yeah, this is a lot of interesting information, and I also tie it back to just like the research being done on neuroplasticity and the fact that it is true that we can change the algorithms in our mind and we can rewire our operating systems. And so generally, when you look at that in society, you think to yourself, yeah, we can rewire these systems. And I'd be curious to gather your thoughts on like education. I mean, big time education, institutional education. What's your view on that? What do you think the purpose of education is? And I'd be really actually interested in your thought on the next evolution of learning, or is it the fact that we should be unlearning? Walk us through your mindset on that.
Oh, this is a juicy one in my household.
Right.
Yeah. The kind of humorous, provocative debate in our household is whether or not we believe in college.
Right.
My wife is an educator. I am a lifelong learner, so I fell in love with her because of her education sensibilities. But I really question exactly how you framed it. I don't question learning. I love learning. Yeah. We need to do learning more. The institutionalization that we have called the enterprise of learning education is no longer set up at scale for true learning in the way I believe in it, right? And Albert Einstein once said, talking about my George O'Keeffe quote, I love the Albert Einstein quote. He says, "The only thing that gets in the way of my learning is my education."
Yeah, right? Exactly.
I think sometimes we have confused the formality and the institutional structures of learning, which we call education, with learning, right? They're not the same, right? They're not the same term. They're not the same grammar. They don't function in the same way in the social system and enterprise of learning. I'm interested in unlearning because one of the ideas I propose in the book is that we're living in a time between what I'm calling legacy narratives and emerging challenger narratives, like a baton pass. I call it the cultural interregnum, that two eras of the cultural operating system are getting like code rewritten on top of one another at the same time. It's why there's sometimes some tension, almost like there's kind of like the birthing pains of the next era being born, right?
Yeah.
And I think part of what is required in that is to unlearn things that maybe are inheritance structures, inherited ideas that no longer are working for us, right? So for example, is Black Lives Matter simply a protest of a singular event? Or is Black Lives Matter an active work, a movement, an active project to unlearn racism?
Right.
Right. So seeing, like, kind of reading stories or events that are happening in society as evidence of how narratives are descending and ascending, and understand what is it that we learn about the human condition and what is it we're trying to unlearn. It's like wind the clock forward, wind the clock back. That kind of dialing up and dialing down, like, you know, life is the arena of the best learning, just being with it, right? And I think sometimes when we add too much structure and we remove ourselves from life, it creates a kind of artificial distance between us and the river and stream of it all, right? And we kind of do this disassociation. I mean, I think Black Lives Matter is perhaps one of the most fascinating and important movements in American history. But how do we understand that inside of these legacy narratives and emerging challenger narratives? And where does that operate for us to understand, considering your audience, as entrepreneurs, as business leaders, as cultural leaders, as nonprofits, as activists, as ourselves propelled by curiosity to really question what really is going on here? How do we see this baton pass in context, right? That is itself like being with it and learning and reading all the layers of what's going on. Whew, that takes some courage.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think on a lot of the issues that we're grappling with in the narratives were, what would be the word, questioning or challenging. There's a dialogue going on in the public sphere, but I feel like where people make the most progress is when they have dialogue about these central questions in smaller groups of people, like, you know, talking about something that really having your view questioned in a one-on-one interaction with someone who holds a different position is very different than listening to, you know, your favorite commentator sort of, you know, straw man the other position. So yeah, I think there's something to be said for engaging in more intimate interactions. And that kind of ties into one of the things in one of the later chapters in your book around trust walks and just like getting back out into nature, into the real world with people, syncing up your wavelengths through just walking side by side. I thought that was really a nice chapter and something that we can all really put into practice quite easily. Don't need to move mountains to be able to just get out there and walk with someone and hear what's on their mind.
Yeah, I love that you responded and were engaged with that story. Yeah, I especially here we are, right? We're having a Zoom call, right? In a mediated environment. We're using all of the signals of who talks when and how to be polite and how to read the signals, right? But yeah, I mean, I don't know, is it revolutionary now to just like go take a walk? Right. I mean, are we there? We're there. Okay, we're there. But there's a deep, beautiful history. Like Socrates used to teach his classes on walks. Steve Jobs was famous for walking the Infinite Loop campus with business colleagues. And what I shared was I was doing this research that, there really is neuroscience about how we wind up tuning and dropping our guard, and physiologically we open up with someone when we take a walk with them. So I'm kind of prototyping this language of trust walking. It's a new concept that we introduced with the book, and I've been doing it. I'd love to do it more and more intentionally, right? Like let's bring back office hours of walks with friends and colleagues, and can we use walking as a way to imagine what we want to happen next?
Sounds like a great idea. I would also say, just to linger on this point around narratives, whether it's a legacy narrative or an emerging narrative, and tying it to some of the storytelling that's taking place, is, this idea that we need to simply recognize that stories are powerful. Stories can overtake us in many cases. And so anytime we're engaging in these situations, Jay, you mentioned in like smaller groups, we just talked about doing it on walks. I think there's a responsibility that if you engage in an exchange of ideas, it is your responsibility to do that without any harm. In other words, you're responsible for the mind parasites that you're going to put in another person. And so if you're out there sharing bad ideas, that is really a responsibility I think you really need to think about. And I'm gaining all of this, like linking your story and your book and your comments just now to a previous guest we had on, who was Dr. Andy Norman, and he wrote a book called Mental Immunity, which is talking about like mind parasites and infectious ideas and how you can think or try to find better ways to think. And I just feel like there's this connection between emerging narratives, storytelling, and our responsibility to make sure that the idea exchange we're a part of is one that's helping us collectively thrive. Anyway.
Love that. No, I love that. I was just pausing because we had some sound in the background. Yeah, I think just maybe like as a quick reply, because you set up so gorgeously. Look, I think stories and storytelling is a much more powerful architecture for change and how we understand our identity than we give credit for, right? There's a part in the book where I kind of chronicle how many multi-billion-dollar blockbusters are based on dystopias. And what does it do to us to constantly be bombarded by apocalyptic negative narratives, right? And it's a kind of, it's a plea for, can we imagine the utopian film, the utopian narrative? When did it become not cool to work on a positive outcome, right? It's like, so it's just really interesting. I think religion is a narrative. Capitalism is a narrative, right? Narratives and stories that we have defined as like the laws of gravity are all around us. And I think it's really interesting to imagine what I've been calling generative stories, generative storytelling, right? Not stories that are static, or not stories that are about scarcity, but stories that create value, right? Money is not the only form of value, right? We create value out of thin air. We call it marketing and advertising, right? But it's like, these are old expressions of this. Beautiful aspirational stories of like, what is worth waking up in the morning for? If I could tell you a brand story that is about a company that you want to join as a cause and a movement, I don't care if they're selling shoelaces or the next form of energy. That's an exciting, purposeful story. Commerce is just an exchange to find value in the story that we want to find ways to live through. I think we need to just kind of listen to and kind of understand stories as almost like a kind of like a blood, a kind of heartbeat of our culture, and give them their credit in Day in the Sun.
Yeah, I would say you can use stories as a way to find threads between people instead of layers. And I think that in the context of you mentioning how we're bombarded with dystopian, film and all that, at the same time, less than 15% of US citizens traveled abroad in 2019. So a lot of people are sitting on the couch getting fed their narratives as opposed to actually being proactive and going out in the world and traveling and opening up their own minds and opening up their own perspectives. And so I just really think that's interesting, because at the end of the day, without the travel and the experiences, you're missing out on the spectrum of humans that does exist, which again allows you the chance to, instead of seeing layers between people, you see threads.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, one thing I was just going to weave into this
please,
as well.
please.
I think we need stories at the end of the day too, because the world is so big and so complex. To Arjun's point about travel, I mean, there's so much to see that we couldn't really have a read on the world through knowledge alone. There's just no way we could know enough about enough individual pieces of information and organize them in our brain in such a way that it creates a perspective out on the world. Like, we need stories because they're dense, they're dense with hopefully virtue and wisdom, and without them, we would sort of be reduced to just consuming algorithms, and that's obviously not how the human mind works. So it's really important to have, I think, healthy stories governing society, because wherever you've lived in history or wherever you've lived in the world, there is some kind of narrative that's driving you and your culture forward. So it's important that it's a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know. You guys are like masterclass radical curiosity. I didn't even need to show up for this one.
I feel like you're speaking to the choir on this subject, because I mean, like, Jay and I started the podcast because of our curiosity, and I think because of our desire to have this, like, our love for education drives us, and our love for being able to connect the dots and finding our own ignorance, and then also finding where we're going to grow. I mean, that's really why we started this, because at the end of the day, we can use this forum for us to not only like take the information in, grow from it personally, but then share it with people so we can collectively thrive. So the radical curiosity floats within us. But I also think that at the same time, like, yes, I can acknowledge that, but I also feel like I could be better at asking questions. I could be better at being effective with my questions. And so there's still room for improvement in my journey towards being curious.
Well, I mean, for whatever it's worth, right? Just showing up and deciding to have a conversation is half of the battle, right? So the idea that you all have started this platform, I love that you do it together, right? I mean, I think the idea that you have journey partners in each other and you bring this diverse set of voices on to explore together. It's a version, one of the ideas in the book I talk about is the concept of fourth places.
Yes.
Right. So we've heard a lot about third places, right? In sociology, first place is the home. Second place is work. Third place are like those social capital neighborhood associations. But I think things have gotten too complex, too big and entrenched, that just having a neighborhood association where people are just connecting is no longer enough. So I introduced the idea of fourth places, where what if fourth places were third places where connectivity and community is built, but the objective of fourth places is to actively work on the future. Like, to me, this forum, this is a fourth place where you're asking questions, you're having dialogue, co-authoring and imagining the future or issues that you're trying to untangle and make sense of, both for you as guides, but with your audience and for your audience. And I'm sure you have ways in digital media that you engage with them, right?
Right.
But I think that we can't imagine the future if we don't talk about it or ask questions about it. I mean, we can't make justice if we've not experienced it or told ourselves stories about it, right? Activism is no longer saying that that's not right. Protest is no longer enough. To riff on what we were saying earlier, we need stories, not just because life would be like the matrix and the code, to your amazing point, right? We need stories because it's a way to organize our imaginations to make an alternate reality feasible. Right. We can't just say that's not okay. We have to say, and it could look like this. We need our imaginations to invent new worlds, where we began our conversation, right? To me, entrepreneurship and questioning is world building. And if we're not world building, then we're just phoning it in.
What would you say to the people that say that having the time to imagine is a luxury?
I would agree. And I think, indeed, just as there is economic inequity, one of the principles I kind of, courageously and daringly put out there is, has the act of framing a question become its own inequity? Is there such a thing as question inequity? Who gets to author the conversation? Who gets to author the question? Who has the luxury of framing the inquiry for all of us, right? Yeah. If you're trying to just survive, you don't have the gift of the time and space to ask questions. And perhaps, that reference, the idea that you're so beautifully planting as a seed, this comes from also a kind of critique of what do we define as poverty? In this country, the historic legacy narrative of poverty is kind of an abstract equation surrounded by how many calories someone consumes. Right? Like the policy of what we define the poverty line is, what that economic number is, very much an abstraction of what we define as a good life or a moral life. What if the poverty line, what if it's a human right to have curiosity? What if part of the human, what it means to be defined as human is to be able to ask questions, to contribute to our collective narrative? And are there hundreds of millions of people who don't have the time, the space, the capacity, have not been invited into that dialogue? That's a much more profound and maybe potentially more important version of the DEI debate, right?
Yeah, which again is, one of those things that can be labeled as, on paper, has really good intent, but seems awfully difficult to execute. It's like a movement. You see that it's been like that for a couple of years now. I would argue that somebody listening to this might say that even about radical curiosity. Like, yeah, that sounds great on paper, but again, even after this entire conversation, still hard for me to do. Like, I can't imagine myself in a situation that I'm going to question anything. Like, I can see somebody out there thinking that. I just feel like there's a lot of this. Like,
can I just challenge that a second, though?
Please.
Yeah,
please.
I think those people are practicing radical curiosity unwittingly, unknowingly, and it's not been named or honored or respected. See, I think people are asking questions all the time. They're asking big questions. I think a lot of institutions don't know how to recognize it and envelop it as constructive value creation in culture and society. I think we've tricked ourselves to believe that curiosity is not thriving, I raise it as endangered species mostly to poke the bear, to say, I think it's happening everywhere. We're just not allowing it into the narrative, right?
Yeah, so then pull on that,
point,
because
let's challenge the DEI question. You say, yeah, a lot of people, but why do we even, I talk about this in the book, why do we even want inclusivity? Why do we even want diversity? Is it because it's politically correct? Is it because we're repairing a narrative of harming cultures and audiences and communities from the past? So is it a reparation? Do we want it because diversity brings greater solutions when teams and ensembles of different points of view work? Like, I think it's so convoluted. We're not even sure why we want it. We want diversity, we want inclusivity, but I think we've lost the plot as to why. And I think all those reasons are true. There's many more. But we don't even ask the question, right? What is inclusivity? What does it look like? What does it feel like? Why would it improve society? Why would it improve business? And there's lots of great thinkers and activists who we can welcome into that discourse that have beautiful insights about that. But even let's start with the conversation, right?
100%. Yeah. And I think one thing I've been trying to find a place for in this conversation too is like the importance of turning that curiosity on your own thinking. I think we think a lot about echo chambers as being these things we get caught in when we're watching TV or we're on the internet, but we all have kind of our own echo chamber in our own minds by way of, the stories that we've been telling ourselves for years, or the way we look at ourselves in the world, those monologues, those loops that we fall into. So I think like one of the most important ways of harnessing radical curiosity, and something that can create tangible transformation almost immediately, is really looking at your own thinking and trying to turn itself on its head. No pun intended. I think we've all had those moments, I guess they call them, epiphanies, where you're like, wow, that was, that what I thought was truth for so long really was not truth. Like I was off base on that. And I think there can be a lot of discomfort getting there, but once you actually let go of it, it feels really good. We do get attached to our stories and our loops, but once you kind of become unburdened of it, you're kind of happy to see it go if it was something that wasn't serving you or those around you.
I love that. No, I think applying the practice to ourselves, to kind of flip it back to us as the actor, is a very important frame. What you're describing reminds me of one of the threads that I was particularly excited about to share in the book is this idea of awe, A-W-E, awe, right? And one of the things I found is there's some beautiful new kind of language and articulation of, in our psychology and in the neuroscience, of what happens to us when we experience awe, right? And one of the great definitions that I talk about in the book is that, how we kind of colloquially, we say, oh my God, this is blowing my mind. Like, wow, you see the Grand Canyon, or you're introduced to a crazy idea and you go, my God, this is blowing my mind. We kind of say that in part because, and you talked about this earlier, but when a new idea is introduced to us that literally kind of violates our understanding of the world, your mind actually has to acquire that idea and integrate it into the way it organizes itself. It's like literally your synapses are firing and you're making room. Like when you say my mind is blown, it's almost like literally your mind as a computer is acquiring an OS upgrade, right? And I love this idea, right? Because it could be the sublime, like the Grand Canyon, something so big that you feel small. But it also can be a new idea or new piece of information. Like, whoa, I never saw it that way. I thought of this when you said this epiphany, this way in which we confront the limits of our own understanding. This is a kind of radical curiosity that is like multi-sensory, and to put ourselves in positions to embrace awe and let it rewire us. That could be what I propose as a leadership or innovation practice, right? Imagine awe as a strategy for innovating at your business, right? Like, what if the best thing we could do is like imagine bringing your executive team to the Grand Canyon and just say like, let's just take this in a second, shall we? Right? Like, with so many of our own biases or the frames, we're in, that's why I'm talking about putting ourselves in uncomfortable positions is a way to kind of invite awe to go to work on us.
Yeah, that's interesting because with that and with a lot of what we've talked about comes the idea of also having the beginner's mindset. And going into the situations with just that understanding as well, that you can approach something with a new perspective on it, or be open to the fact that you're not going to have the same perspective after the experience that you're going through. So I think beginner's mindset has something to do with that as well. And then another thing, I mean, just something that we can talk about a little bit is just like where we can find humor in our day to day. I feel like laughing is maybe difficult for some people given how hard life can feel, but when you realize like how funny life really is, when you think about what your expectation of a scenario is versus the reality of that scenario, oftentimes that's where you find the humor in life to keep you going. I mean, at the end of the day, like, we have this very short experience, we should try to enjoy it and have fun with it.
Yeah, well, that, and also it's interesting because the way I'm describing awe is a great connection to humor. I mean, humor is the lead frame of a couple of my chapters. I'm a big fan of humor. My father likes to believe he's a comedian, but comedy and the use of humor to welcome curiosity into our lives is like a really effective vehicle, right? So awe as an interruption in the way things are is very similar to incongruity humor, right? So incongruity is a kind of, it's one of the core 3 or 4 models of how comedy and humor work, right? So incongruity humor is about that surprising juxtaposition, right? It's very popular now, right? The setup in the joke, and then the unexpected twist, right? That kind of juxtaposition of it's like the misdirect, right? And then I bring you somewhere else. But these are devices where somehow it's almost like physiologically we laugh, we release the anxiety of the tension of, I thought I knew how the world worked. Nope, you're surprising me and reintroducing it to me. And humor has become a great way, as we know, right? The Dave Chappelles, the Hannah Gadsby's, the Jon Stewarts of the world, who have introduced political satire to use humor to show us just how incongruity is alive every day in the way that our world is unfolding. And so it's a really beautiful device to be a critic, but also to dare an audience to welcome curiosity into popular culture.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like I'm learning how to laugh through difficult situations. I'm finding that when you laugh, you kind of unlock yourself a little bit. And that's one of the best things that I personally have found myself. If I'm in a difficult situation, I'm trying to laugh. And there's this thing, right? It's like when the tough gets going, when the going gets tough, the tough gets going. I'm thinking that when the going gets tough, they first laugh and then they get going. You know what I mean? Like they got to unlock themselves. So, I mean, that's where I'm at on that.
Well,
for sure.
I know we're coming to the top of our hour. I just wanted to take a minute. I wanted to say to you both, you open by being very kind about, you've only had a couple days with the digital PDF of the book, and you kind of took a look at it. I got to be honest with you. These have been great, very informed questions and threads that you've pulled. I just want to say, to honor also another part of the book, Olay, right? So Olay is like, let's acknowledge when something wonderful and beautiful has happened, right? Olay to the bullfighter. We say Olay when we see human beings doing talented, wonderful things. I want to kind of start to close by just saying, Olay to you guys. This has been a really rich conversation. I know this is not your only gig, and I'm really touched that you found threads that resonate with you. So thank you, and Olay to you.
No, I appreciate that. And I would say that it's been a pleasure to have you on and share space. And I think it's been great to actually go through this exercise and hear your story, hear your experience, and actually, I'm also thinking about the work that you're going to continue to do after this episode. Like, you're going to continue to shine light on why it's important to ask questions, why it's important to remain curious. And I just think that as this world becomes more decentralized, a person's ability to be radically curious could be what separates them and allows them to survive. So I appreciate you spending time with us.
Absolutely. You guys are awesome. Thanks so much for having me on the discussion.
Thank you, Seth. It's been a pleasure.
A delight.